Straight Band has made a big move on the far outside. They're coming down to the final furlong. Here comes Straight Band on the outside, and Straight Band has come from far back to take the lead. Dorada now second, but Straight Band is beginning to move away, and this will be a signature moment for Straight Band. Straight Band wins the cotillion just over 2 at the end. What a finish in the Pennsylvania Derby. Here comes Math Wizard on the far outside. Math Wizard, Mr. Money. Math Wizard on the outside. Math Wizard, yes sir!
And on the far outside in the dark silks, it's Cortland Simmons blasting past the leaders to move to the front in the podcast world as he comes through to the finish to recap the Pennsylvania Derby here at the CS Racing Report. What an event it was at Parks Racing, $1 million on the line, 9 furlongs, top 3-year-olds going that 9 furlong route. And Math Wizard, in sort of describing myself, did what, as I described in the introduction, blasted past the front runners off a very, very slow pace to win this race by a neck in 150.94 for the 9 furlongs over Mr. Money, who was a length in front of War of Will, who finished a nose in front of Improbable, who was the favorite going into the post at post time. Spun to Run was 5th, and Shanghai Superfly picked up the rear as expected in 6th. And again, as Nick Luck so accurately described in the post-race comments, this was a pedestrian pace, 24.20 for the quarter, 49.30 for the half, as the race caller accurately announced. A very slow half mile, 49.30, 113.20 for the 3 quarters, as Mr. Money, sort of, as it was described, Gabriel Saez had a hand and both hands full with Mr. Money sort of not necessarily fighting his rider, but sort of pulling his rider to the lead. He inherited the lead. I think they wanted to wrangle back a little bit, but the pace was slow. Improbable didn't break. He was expected to be part of the speed, and so he ended up being on the front end, and they inherently went slow. War of Will didn't want it after what happened in the Jim Dandy when he fell apart after having what was in many ways as ideal a pace scenario up front at Saratoga as he did, as Mr. Money did here in the Pennsylvania Derby. So he held back. So you had horses that, as Randy Moss has described in the past, when horses finish very, very closely, a lot of times it is because it's a slowly run race, and that's exactly what happened in this 2019 40th edition of the Pennsylvania Derby. And Math Wizard was the best horse. He was on the widest part of the racetrack for the newly hired Irad Ortiz Jr., who came in for the mount to Parks. He was in the widest part of the racetrack, and he was still able to win by a neck. A very, very nice performance, 30-to-1 odds. Somebody at Parks and around the country and around the world who was wagering on this race got paid when this horse came in to get his first Grade 1 win for Safi A. Joseph Jr., the trainer, and for for the aforementioned Irad Ortiz Jr. Again, where does this put the 3-year-olds in terms of the impact of the Breeders' Cup? Most people are not going to cash their chips on Math Wizard to be a serious contender, even though at 1.25 miles he would get a more ideal, in theory, he would get a more ideal pace scenario in the Breeders' Cup Classic, the added ground if he wants it, and a situation which, again, as Jerry Bailey has always said, come from behinders is very hard for them to win consistently because you have to overcome pace and traffic. He'll get the pace, and obviously if he's able to avoid traffic, he's going to be able to make his run, and perhaps he can hit the board if he doesn't win it outright. So is he a horse that is capable of doing that? A lot of people believe he's going to be a price. I certainly concur with that. Mr. Money ran, this was maybe, a situation in which when asked to go to the well one more time, he wasn't able to deliver. Got an ideal pace scenario, although I don't think he really wanted to necessarily be crawling on the lead either way. Despite that, the pace was one in which he should have finished a little better than what he did. War of Will ran a good race compared to the Jim Dandy. It was a marked improvement, and Improbable, again, the gate problems once again surfaced as they always seem to with this horse. He didn't break very, very well, but he had plenty of time to be able to not only mount a strategy, but generate a run. He tried to do that on the inside, which I don't necessarily think is the best part of the racetrack, but he still got a ground-saving trip, and he just didn't have the afterburners or the explosiveness to win this race. And if you weren't convinced after the Preakness that he's not a Grade 1 level type of horse, or that the distance is really aren't his friend, you certainly have to, you certainly are more than convinced now that he's really not an elite racehorse. Again, Bob Baffert might be able to sort of readjust the program for him. Maybe he runs in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. We'll just have to see how that goes. But either way, Math Wizard has certainly got a winning year-in ticket to the Breeders' Cup. How good of a horse he is going against the older horses, again, that's to be determined in the next few weeks. The spacing of this race really fits him very, very well. And because of the fact that it's the same sort of timing as it was after the West Virginia Derby, in which his trainer felt the horse might have been a little fatigued, got the time that he needed to be able to run his best race here. He's going to get that same gap going to the Breeders' Cup, and we'll see if he can perform against the older horses. And again, Mr. Money, it was always going to be sort of a borderline candidate to go 1.25 miles. Certainly a great candidate for the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. We'll see if, in fact, they change their minds and say maybe he could improve and go 1.25 miles. But the likelihood is he's probably unlikely to run in the Breeders' Cup Classic. War Will, you know how Mark Casse is. He's a very, very aggressive trainer, and Mark Casse is one of those types who will run him. It'll be interesting to see if maybe they adjust their plans and also look at the 8 furlongs versus the 10. He ran a good race here. This is obviously going to be, for a lot of these horses, the final race until the Breeders' Cup. Improbable, as I aforementioned, probably the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. It is a home game with the World Championships being at Santa Anita, so maybe that's going to be the alternative for him. But then again, Bob Baffert might just say, look, he needed the race. He just didn't need to come out of the gate as slowly as he did. And so again, that's just one of those things that, again, that may be something that maybe he's adding up, but I think overall, I think right now it's looking like Mucho Gusto is going to be more than likely the candidate for him to run in the Breeders' Cup Classic amongst the 3-year-olds that he has, along with McKenzie, who should be going in the Awesome again as his final prep for the Breeders' Cup Classic. When looking at these 3-year-olds coming out of this race, I think most people believe the top contenders are going to be, I don't think Maximum Security, as I aforementioned, is probably not going to run in the Breeders' Cup, given that he's also owned by Marion Gary West, who basically put Game Winner on the shelf. And given this latest incident with the colic, I just don't see that it's a more likely than less that he's going to make the Breeders' Cup. So you got to look at Code of Honor, Tacitus, Tax, maybe. Again, he's going to have to improve off the Travers. He didn't run particularly well. So with that being said, maybe there are a couple Pennsylvania Derby horses in here. Obviously, Math Wizard is going to the Breeders' Cup, barring any setback. And Mr. Money is borderline. I do think between War Will and Improbable, one of those horses may end up going. I can tell you that I think it's more likely that a lot of these horses, we're going to see a couple of these funnel in to the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. That could even include Mucho Gusto, who I still think is a classic contender from the Travers. And then you look at War Will, Improbable, and maybe Mr. Money. Between those three, I think 1, 2, if not all 3 are going to shorten up and go 8 furlongs versus trying the 10. I could be very wrong. It could end up being that some of these trainers believe these horses are going to improve and be able to, compete with the older horses. I think most people believe, minus the winner, that it's less likely that those horses are going to do that, and that depending on what happens in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, people are cashing their chips on Code of Honor and Tacitus to really do something. Again, we'll take a look at who is leading the division. I personally think Code of Honor is the leader, but you could easily make a tiebreaker case for Maximum Security, because even if you want to not take the 600-pound gorilla out of the room of Maximum Security being disqualified in the Kentucky Derby, you are then saying to yourself that he has beaten Code of Honor twice. I look at it like he has beaten Code of Honor in the one meeting in which officially the results counted, and that Code of Honor beating Maximum Security, beating Mucho Gusto in the Haskell, along with Spun to Run, who had no impact in that race, was left behind, certainly didn't run well, in finishing 5th in the Pennsylvania Derby, and King for a Day, who didn't participate in either the Travers or the Pennsylvania Derby. Maximum Security beating those horses is less significant than Code of Honor beating Mucho Gusto, in addition to Tax and Tacitus at 1.25 miles in the Travers. That's the tiebreaker for me. But I can also see the other argument, or the other viewpoint, that Maximum Security is in front. At the least, they are certainly the top 2, and you could make an argument or a case that they're maybe co-number ones. It's a virtual tie. So again, Math Wizard does put his name in the hat, maybe not to win the Eclipse Award, but who knows, maybe he could win the Breeders' Cup Classic and perhaps put the writers and journalists in a position where they have to consider. He wins the Pennsylvania Derby in 150.94, defeating Mr. Money, who had beaten him convincingly in the West Virginia Derby. He also beats War Will, who did improve off his disaster in the Jim Dandy and the recent efforts in which he hasn't performed well, the Belmont Stakes, Louisiana Derby, Kentucky Derby, as well as Improbable, who at this point it's pretty safe to say, even if you weren't convinced off the Preakness being the favorite after running 5th in the Derby, where he bombed at Pimlico, that he's not grade 1 level worthy and he's not as good as we think he is. This effort at finishing 4th probably convinces you a little more, although some believe that he didn't break the way he was supposed to, that he, did get the inside part of the track and he was the best horse in the race. I personally think that because he got the inside and was able to kind of get back into it, if he really had the afterburners and the gears and the explosiveness, he would have won this race and certainly would have been closer. And so again, he's a horse that maybe perhaps you could consider running in an alternative spot, the Breeders' Cup, if Bob Baffert decides to make that decision. But once again, as aforementioned, Math Wizard, very impressive performance coming on the far outside in the widest part of the racetrack to win the 2019 $1 million Pennsylvania Derby in 159.4, defeating those aforementioned horses, Mr. Money, War, Will, and Improbable.
Math Wizard trying to spring a big upset on the far outside. Improbable saving ground all the way, looking to come through on the inside. It's Mr. Money off the turn with the lead. Mr. Money in front. Spoken on the outside. Improbable up the inside. War, Will in between horses. Math Wizard on the far outside. What a finish in the Pennsylvania Derby. Here comes Math Wizard on the far outside. Math Wizard, Mr. Money. Math Wizard on the outside. Math Wizard, yes sir. Math Wizard, 3-1 upset winner in the Pennsylvania Derby.
And you'd need to be a Math Wizard to pick this one. Time of 150.4 for the 40th Pennsylvania Derby. Math Wizard wins for Irad Ortiz and trainer Safi Joseph Jr.
It's the Travers winner, Will Take Charge. He comes from off the pace, and look at Will Take Charge. The big colt has done it again. Will Take Charge by 2.5 over Moreno. California Club on the inside is giving his best, but he's dropping back. It's Byron pulling away. They're coming down to the finish, and it will be Byron, impressive on the front end today. Byron's got it by 5. They're coming to the wire together. It's Connect. Connect has won the Pennsylvania Derby by a half length over Gunrunner. It's all West Coast as they come down to the finish. This is statement for the 3-year-old championship. Wow, West Coast has it by 6 on the wire. McKenzie, it's clear as they come down to the finish. Baffert, Smith, McKenzie, they've done it. McKenzie has it by 2. Summer Squall is now drawing out late. Summer Squall by 2, by 3, by 4. Here he is, folks. Summer Squall has won it.
Now, in the inaugural running of the Pennsylvania Derby, nearing the furlong pole, Smarten now opens up